Now I will give the floor to Morgane Dons. She's the Deputy Director of the International Data Unit at UK's DCMS. So she can give us welcoming remarks. Morgane, you have the floor.
Thanks, Lauren, and hi everyone. Very happy to be here today and to see many of you to talk about sandboxes for data. I just want to give you a bit of context for this work. As you all know, better data use is crucial to enable innovation and growth, helping answer to a pandemic or uncovering the next scientific breakthrough. And so data sharing, access, and enabling the free flow of data is really important to achieve all of this. So that's why it's important for countries and specifically the UK. And this is why, as part of a national data strategy, we are trying to unlock the power of data, including through enabling the free flow of data across border. That's our mission 5 of the National Data Strategy. If you're not familiar, you can see it online on gov.uk. And as part of our commitments and under our G7 presidency last year, we committed to work with the IGPN and Datasphere Initiative to create work around any kind of tools of space to encourage data free flow with trust. And this is how this report comes about. The potential for regulatory sandboxes and the opportunities provided by regulatory sandboxes is huge, and we see that as a government and policymakers. Domestically in the UK, we have the Information Commissioner's Office, or the Data Protection Authority, who is doing great work on regulatory frameworks already, and working with businesses to allow to innovate with personal data, to tackle big challenges such as problem gambling or homelessness, which is very, very important, with huge benefits from a social and economic perspective. But of course, data is not just confined across borders, it flows across borders, and therefore we have new set of challenges when thinking about regulatory frameworks and how data flow across borders and operate across border, and how we can make sure that it doesn't impede innovation. Quite the contrary, it kind of allows for a safe innovation and so business, and so we can all benefit from it. So this is why this report is about, and this is why we have invested in this work. And I have to say that the UK government is also investing in creating all of these spaces via different channels, including negotiating wherever we can with other countries, clauses on our fair trade agreements to allow for this discussion to happen, to allow the use of regulatory sandboxes. So I'm thinking specifically on the free trade agreement that we have with Singapore, Australia, for instance, where you will see some language in that effect around enabling data-driven innovation, allowing the use of regulatory sandboxes. That's a bit of a context about the why this report and how this is coming about. And I want to take the opportunity to thank you, the AGPN, the Datasphere Initiative, for all their hard work to kind of produce this report. We see huge value from it already, and I'm hoping for a constructive discussion today, and indeed, since it's very noble work in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manal. Oh, thank you very much, Morgane. I want now to do the actual launch and the presentation to use. So I'll share my screen, and I hope you can see that.
Yes.
Great. So today we are launching the report, Sandboxes for Data, creating spaces for agile solutions across borders. So why did we decide to produce a report on Sandboxes for Data? And this is very much connected to the vision of the Datasphere Initiative, which is a collaboratively governed data sphere. And one of our key objectives also is to improve coordination, accelerate the adoption of concrete proposals to overcome the current tensions and polarizations around data. So this report fits right into that view. And on the understanding as well that today, few mechanisms exist to bridge policy silos and the gaps between technology developments and regulatory frameworks. and that sandboxes can have a potential use anywhere innovation is hampered by a lack of trust or uncertainty about how regulation applies, and also where risks are not fully understood of those technologies. So the notion of cross-border sandboxes for data is now just emerging, and we highlight a few examples in the report. And the objective of this report is to understand how the experiences of sandboxes throughout the world and how they have been manifested, but also how we can apply the lessons learned towards designing and implementing cross-border sandboxes for data. So the report provides a starting point for policymakers to consider different types of sandboxes and how they can be used to build data governance solutions that are more conducive to the complex challenges of data and more agile and multi-stakeholder solutions to those challenges. And you'll see pasted in the chat the link where you can download the report already. So moving next, so what are sandboxes? There are many ways to classify sandboxes, and a few reports have been written on it. Here we chose a taxonomy that characterizes sandboxes in two types. First, the notion of operational sandboxes and how they have been originally conceived in the tech space. So that is test environments where hosted data can be accessed and used. And then on the second, regulatory sandboxes, which are rather collaborative processes where regulators and firms can evaluate new technologies without regulatory frameworks as well, participation with other stakeholders. Many people are familiar with regulatory sandboxes in the case of fintech and how they have been used. And recently, we also have seen more cases that emerge in its use for AI and privacy, for example. So in a nutshell, operational sandboxes, the way that we use throughout the report, actually those spaces that handle data, and regulatory sandboxes, spaces that provide dialogue and guidance on how data is handled. And what we're trying to put forth is a notion of sandboxes that can be a hybrid. So in a nutshell, of the perspective that we're trying to put forth is the notion that there are different types of sandboxes, and we want to consider what's the next phase of sandboxes too, if they will be rather more operational or regulatory or a hybrid or a combination of both. And here I want to zoom in specifically on the experiences of regulatory sandboxes now, and how we have built on the literature and the experience of different use cases to highlight some of the core advantages of sandboxes. And so here to mention a few, and I won't stay too long here, but for companies, sandboxes can help reduce regulatory and legal uncertainty and give innovators access to a controlled test environment, which facilitates market entry and enhances overall competition and access to innovation. So where regulatory requirements are unclear or missing, regulatory sandboxes can help to develop clarity and certainty. For society in general, publicizing the sandboxes of outcomes has been seen to show and drive greater public and political understanding of evolving technologies and practices. For regulatory policymakers, sandboxes can provide a first-hand contact with the latest technological developments and solutions. And all in all, when developing a multi-stakeholder way, sandboxes can help to build consensus and trust and spur innovative collaborations among different stakeholders, including across borders. So what is the potential of sandboxes for data? And that's what we explore in the report. As we know, data now underpins and reflects practically all economic sectors and social activity. So sandboxes can support and respond to this rapidly growing field of innovations and tackle friction and bottlenecks across sectors and policy areas. And I will talk more about innovations and policy sectors in a moment later in the presentation. But to summarize, regulatory sandboxes can be a key part of a data-grounded regulatory policy and legislative development, and can also facilitate better evidence-based policymaking across borders by bringing different countries together to analyze specific technologies and initiatives and to increase the responsible flow of cross-border data to support innovation and socioeconomic development. So what innovative solutions can we test with sandboxes? And here we looked into a few cases in the report. The first one is the notion of emerging intermediaries. So think about examples around data fiduciaries, data trusts, data cooperatives, data commons, or different types of data stewards as well, and how these new emerging business models can have implications in terms of opportunities and managing of risks of different concerns related to data. Another aspect of innovative technologies that we looked into as well were the notion of privacy enhancing technologies. So here examples such as homomorphic encryption, trusted execution environments, multi-party computation, such as federated computing, differential privacy methods, for example. So how could they be tested in those environments across border as well, to see their reach within different countries. But also we note in the report browser solutions for consent management. And here I'm thinking as well on other data management solutions, such as data lineage services, and how they could be tested further as well, and how regulators and policymakers can learn from what those technologies have to offer and what opportunities and risks they may carry as well. And so where could this be applied in terms of having sandboxes for data? They can be applied to a wide range of sectors to find collaborative solutions. In this report, we highlight a few of them. We highlight innovation, trade, and competition related to digital policies. We zoom into the emerging digital economy partnership agreements that have now explored different ways to increase cooperation. The Digital Economy Partnership Agreement between Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore is a good example that we use there as well. We mentioned other types of agreements in different multi-stakeholder, multilateral fora, such as ASEAN, for example, as well, understanding how they could be used to find more collaborative solutions. We also look into the area of health and data related to health and its impact on inclusion. We do a case study on mobility and its effects on social and environmental sustainability as well, and the sharing of what that data means, its bottlenecks, but also interesting low-hanging fruits that could be transposed.
The important thing is that the report, without belaboring on this, is highlighting a certain number of domains and sectors, as Lauren was mentioning at the moment, where the application of regulatory sandboxes as an experiment can be explored and can be used. And one of the objectives that we have on the occasion of this launch of this report is to also bring together a certain number of participants and panelists to exchange on this notion of regulatory sandboxes and explore why it is necessary to have a particular approach that allows to go beyond the dimension of the national implementation of sandboxes to explore how we can do this on a cross-border basis. So maybe before we launch in the discussion, I can introduce the people who will be on this panel. And in addition to Morgan Dons, who was kindly making the early introduction earlier, and we will be able to come back in a further question, we have 4 people joining us for the panel. We have Molly Lesher, who is the Senior Digital Economist and Analyst at the Directorate for Science, Technology and Innovation at the OECD. Maiko Meguro was the Principal Deputy Director at the Unit of International Affairs, Commerce and Information Bureau in the Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, METI. We also have Norberto Andrade, Global Policy Lead for AI Ethics at OpenLoop. And last but not least, Anne Josephine Flanagan was Data Policy and Governance Lead at the World Economic Forum Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And the purpose of this panel is to explore a little bit further this question of regulatory sandboxes and how they can be used. And the first question that I wanted to ask the panelists is basically why we need those exploratory tools. Lorraine had started to explain some of the applications and some of the benefits, but it would be great to have the different perspectives regarding why do we need to experiment with new solutions for data governance, particularly across borders and across boundaries, actually, because it's not only geographic borders, it's also topical borders or sectoral environments. So maybe I can start with you, Molly. How does that relate and connect with the work that you're conducting and overseeing at the OECD?
So thanks so much, Bertrand. Thanks for having me here, and congratulations on the new report. At the OECD, we've worked a little bit on regulatory sandboxes from a digital perspective, as well as thinking about digital policy making from a whole of government, whole of society perspective. Data and data governance is one of those wicked problems that touches on just about every policy community, and it is a very difficult one to address, I think. What we've seen is, as you've said, and Lorraine said, policy experimentation is extremely important. Regulators and policymakers need feedback on pain points, including from businesses, but also from civil society. Now, sandboxes are one form of experimentation that's achieved some success in the financial services sector in particular, but there's certainly other forms of policy experimentation that also need to be considered. And we can think about things like outcome and performance-based regulation, leniency for testing and piloting, class waivers, and the like. Some regulators have also taken a kind of wait and see sort of stance, and we've seen this in the cryptocurrency market recently, with a view to not stifling innovation in the first instance, but as risks continue to grow. And certainly we see that now in the crypto market, now that it's matured somewhat. People start to think about regulating. I think in the sandbox context, at least from the work that we've done, it's really important to think about the specific service or product and to think about what's the best way to experiment with the policy framework. At least from our perspective, there's no real cross-country, cross-sectoral assessment of the efficacy of sandboxes. And I think that's something really important to stress. They seem to work best from what we've seen in very specific and somewhat small product and services that fit really well within one sectoral boundary or within the purview of one regulatory entity. The challenge, I think, for cross-border data flows is that the issues involved are extremely, extremely complicated. They touch upon many parts of the government. And I think I went to almost every committee at the OECD in about 2017-18 to talk about our horizontal project on digital policymaking. Everybody talked about data flows. And what struck me when that happened was the very different vocabulary, for example, that folks from the data protection authorities had versus, let's say, the trade negotiators. They didn't even have the same vocabulary to talk about cross-data flows, let alone in some cases have one unified vision for how to deal with it. And I remember I wrote one paper, we got comments on that draft, data flows was part of it. And I got 7 pages of single-space comments from one country, and they didn't match. I had very different feedback, even on language in one paragraph, from the trade ministry than I did from the Data Protection Agency. And that's, I think, the real challenge when you think about regulating cross-border data flows in a sandbox or kind of anywhere else. I think also one thing I'd say that came out in our work is that administering a sandbox from a regulatory perspective, the costs are non-trivial. And I've seen some studies that it can cost up to $1 million to administer a sandbox program. And that was just one regulator in one country. So when you think about trying to expand this type of policy experimentation across borders, where you've got multiple regulators or parts of the government that need to be involved, and then you multiply that by different countries, I think the costs could end up being somewhat non-trivial. So anyway, those are my kind of initial thoughts. I think it's obviously very important to experiment, and sandboxes can be beneficial, but there are some non-trivial challenges, especially in the data context, that I think need to be thought through.
Well, thank you. And you use the expression wicked problem, which is the classical expression used to say when you're trying to solve a problem in one particular field, because of interdependencies, you actually may be creating a problem in another one. I think you highlighted, it's not necessary to belabor, but the question of the diversity of vocabulary and the different approaches by different ministries within the same country is only compounded when you get across borders, of course. In that regard, I want to go to Maiko because Japan has been instrumental in putting forward the notion of free flow of data with trust, and it has now gotten a lot of traction, both in the G7 and in the G20. And one of the important objectives, I wouldn't say challenges, but it is a challenge, is to put meat on this concept and provide elements that make it more tangible and implementable. So this is one of the reasons why the work is exploring the notion of experimental sandboxes and other practices. So Maiko, can you tell us a little bit more how you see this notion of sandboxes fitting in the nurturing of the concept?
Sure. So thank you so much, Bertrand. So definitely this concept of sandbox is quite useful in terms of really seeking the operationalizing this concept, or I would say mental framework of data free flow with trust. So it's about time that we really have to make it that data free flow with trust is something more than the concept that data can flow with trust. But what do you mean by trust, and what the mechanism, what the system actually make it possible for the data to travel across the borders? And definitely we see the sandbox as an interesting and definitely useful, hopeful option. The reason I say it is particularly because that we by now realize that regulations or rules, international rules, only cannot provide effective solution for this. We all have to think about how we combine the different policy tools as well as technology, like privacy enhancing technologies. But we don't know how. So definitely this sort of experimental exercise will definitely help. But I also cannot agree more with what Molly had just been said, which is there has not been really the practice before us on the cross-border applicability of sandboxes. And this cross-border question of the regulator is particularly what we Japanese government is trying to tackle in materializing, operationalizing DFFT. Because, for example, we did this sort of robust study to the companies that what the barriers you feel in the cross-border situations. And many companies actually mentioned that not necessarily cross borders. For example, within one country, Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Finance, also privacy regulators and security regulators, they all have overlapping, overlapping regulations, but those regulators don't talk to each other, what they call silos. And because of this silo, then also even I have this issue, which is when I talk to other ministries on the same topic, like Molly just said, they use different vocabularies. So sometimes we think that we understand kinda, but we're not sure that we actually understand each other, although we're speaking in Japanese. And this multiplies when we speak in English, French, different languages. So this is something we're really trying to work towards G7 in next presidency. And also, of course, we also find this recent outcome of the digital ministerial by the Germany. We adapted this like a data action plan, but that was really, of course, that was just a first step. But we see that the work is huge. And many works actually build around the preparation ground for make it possible for this kind of cross-border regulatory sandboxes. Like we work on the, for example, we have to explain that what each regulator means by saying this regulation, for example, like transparency. So we need to have more elementary or more primitive steps to work together among certain number of countries or even certain number of regulators to prepare for the ground for this kind of super innovative regulatory sandboxes cross-border situation. In this regard, I was quite intrigued by one of the example within your report on the ASEAN GSMA regulatory pilot space for cross-border data flows. In a way, I'm super curious that how this project would turn out in the end, how they worked on this sort of problem that I and also Mori have just mentioned. So this is my preliminary statement.
Thank you so much, Meiko. I mean, the re-emphasis of the diversity of perspective from different ministries, but you also pointed to something that is extremely important, which is a sort of techno-legal complex, where both the regulation and the technology are nurturing each other, sometimes in competition, but sometimes also in an enabling manner. I think that's a perfect transition to Norberto Andrade from Open Loop to look at precisely how this relationship between the technological developments and the legal environment can function. And we'll do a first round with the panelists, and maybe as I see that Lorraine is back, we can have a segment back on the end of the presentation of the report before we do the final round of questions. Norberto.
Thank you, Bertrand, and thanks, Lorraine and the team for the kind invitation. Yeah, so I will take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the interaction between law and technology in the context of experimentation, and just taking a step back and answering to your first question about why do we actually need to experiment, and going really high level, I think because the world is just becoming more and more complicated and complex and granular, and for every challenge and problem that is posed, we have more and more different possible solutions and pathways. And it's getting complicated not only in terms of the technology, but also in terms of the legal and the regulatory environment. So what we see is that the space of uncertainty to actually understand what kind of solution we should go for is just increasing and increasing. And for that sheer reason, I think we need to do more experimentation. We need to find ways to narrow this space of uncertainty by experimenting, by trying in safe testing environments some of those solutions and get the evidence of which one works better. So at the high level, I think that experimentation really needs to scale up and be more and more practiced in general in the policy community. In terms to your question about the interaction of law and technology in the context of experimentation, I will briefly just describe what the Open Loop is trying to do in that front. And then basically Open Loop is a global program through which we connect the folks that are developing technologies with the ones that are regulating the technology. So it's a consortium composed of industry partners, but also regulators and governments, and more so also with members of civil society and academia, where we either co-create or test existing governance frameworks. And these can be all the way from ethical principles and codes of conduct to proposed legislation, specific articles and provisions within proposed legislation that is being negotiated. So it's in a way a flexible and versatile program through which we try to inform the regulatory debate by providing evidence-based input on how those normative provisions that we are testing, how do they resonate with the real world? So basically, can we have a better understanding of how technically feasible these normative provisions are when you ask engineers and product managers in tech companies to apply them? Can we gain a better understanding of how they are understood by their addressees? Can we have a better idea of how cost effective they are, and if the companies have the right set of resources to actually comply with them? And this is where it gets interesting, because in terms of our own methodology, we've been looking at how technology is actually built and deployed, and we're trying to take a page from that process and apply it to policy making. Why don't we actually approach policy in a more iterative trial and error method that we see in how technology is built? We all know that new technology is never created on one go. It's never the very first version that goes directly to market. It normally goes through continuous experimental and iterative processes. So why don't we do the same thing, by default with policy and lawmaking? Why don't we do more research, experimentation, testing, evaluation before we pull the trigger and we enshrine those normative provisions into legislation? So I think it's important to kind of understand this synergy that we are trying to get from technology and apply it to the policy making process, and be able to find ways to run sort of reality checks on tech policies by applying this type of methodology. To give a couple of examples to be more concrete, we've been partnering with a number of governments and policy stakeholders by testing specific aspects of the artificial intelligence governance framework. So, for example, we've deployed an open loop program in Europe where we co-created from scratch a risk assessment framework. We wanted to understand what would be the right set of normative procedures and processes that would need to be put into place to understand and support tech companies in assessing the risks that are posed by their AI systems. In Singapore, we've leveraged the existing AI governance model framework that they've published there to test specific aspects of the AI transparency and explainability. And more recently, in India and Japan, we are testing the implementation of ethical principles, namely the principle of human centricity. And we are very eager to understand how this set of ethical principles that are very similar from region to region, from countries to countries in terms of AI ethics and responsible AI, how are they actually being implemented on the ground? How can we leverage specific contextual and regional factors into that implementation? And we do all of this through a methodology that we call policy prototyping. And the idea is really to flesh out these prototypes, these governance frameworks, and come up with a methodology that will enable us to collect feedback from participants, namely from tech companies, on how those governance frameworks resonate. So at the heart of the open loop is really this idea that the way that technology is built, there's a lot to learn from it and a lot to explore in terms of how policy and laws should actually also be built. So let me stop here as the first intervention.
Thank you, Norberto. This is opening up so many things that we don't have time to explore in more detail, but I just want to highlight the resonance of everything that you're mentioning regarding the iterative nature, the policy prototyping, the co-creation, the mechanisms that allow to basically adapt to a faster speed of change that doesn't allow to treat regulation in a traditional way, especially for cross-border matters, but to make a move from regulation, traditional regulation, separating clearly the regulator and the regulated, to something that is much more akin to data governance, where there's a co-creation and co-experimentation of the different parameters. And this resonates very much with a lot of the mission and the perspective of the Datasphere Initiative. So it's music to our ears to hear you say this, which is actually a good transition to ask Anne-Joséphine Flanagan from the WEF how does that resonate with the work that is being conducted in the WEF, and particularly in the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution? How do you see the need for experimentation?
Great question, Bertrand. Thank you for having me here today, and congratulations on this report. My eyes lit up when I saw the draft of this in my inbox. So I'm in the part of the World Economic Forum called the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, but we're actually a global network headquartered in San Francisco, California. We're only established about 5 years, so the forum itself is over 50 years old. You'll all be aware of the annual meeting that's taking place right now in Davos, but there is another part of the forum that looks specifically at technology policy governance. So I'm working on initiatives specifically around data. And when I talk about that global network, we, of course, the World Economic Forum is a neutral platform for public-private collaboration, but really it's multi-stakeholder collaboration. So governments, businesses, academics, and civil society actors, and we bring everybody together to try to address some of those wicked problems that Molly mentioned, or I think we term them as intractable problems. And we have a global network of, I think it's 14 at this point, affiliate centers, where we have collaborations with governments on the ground. Those centers, I think the newest one was signed in Serbia earlier in the spring, but I think the oldest center is only about 2.5 years old. So really, in some ways embryonic, but it's fascinating to see these centers emerge and grow. And what those centers do is that they collaborate, provide collaboration in a multi-stakeholder fashion on the ground at government level, supported by the forum, so supported by the machine, if you will, of the forum. That's access to our network, that's operational support, and that's the ability to harness and leverage the projects that we've been running mostly out of San Francisco, but also out of Japan and out of our other centers globally, including our headquarters in Geneva. And the whole agile governance conversation is really what started the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. It's how do we provide a platform to start to try to hold those conversations to close that gap. And I think it brings up a really important point about, I think Molly has brought it out and Norberto has brought it out as well, which is really around what do we mean by policy for technology? What does policy look like? A lot of people think regulation. And what's really interesting about agile governance is it can provide alternative solutions to regulation. Obviously, in terms of that evidentiary base for technology, for data, we're at a frontier that we've never been at as humanity. Not to get too philosophical about it, but one of the difficulties, and I'm a former government and EU official myself, it's so difficult to try to foresee how to regulate something as intangible as data. And it's very, very difficult to, nobody has a crystal ball in terms of what technologies are coming around the corner. Really appreciate the point that Norberto just made about how regulations can be set in stone and quite normative in nature, but really we don't know what's going to happen. So to answer your question, Bertrand, the regulatory sandboxes, including what we effectively have in our affiliate center network, provide a space for, yes, experimentation, but also I think inclusivity is a really, really important point. That multi-stakeholder approach where you can understand working with companies, not just technology companies, but local actors, to the point on how is this seen from context to context that Maiko raised earlier on. Where are the commonalities in how countries approach this? Where are the cultural differences? What type of language are we using? And in providing that inclusivity, able to provide a space to find out what are the more incremental solutions that can be brought about. How can we make governance itself more agile so that it's not a case of a regulation comes out today and it's set in stone for years to come? Can we learn as we go? New technologies are being created all the time. I also really want to call out two other aspects. We developed a roadmap for cross-border data flows in 2020, and the world has moved on a lot since 2020. But what we learned through that piece of work was that it's all about incentives. Why on earth would you want to cooperate across borders in the first place in terms of data? It's about supporting economic growth. It's about supporting social inclusion. That means that it's good for citizens. That means that it's good for businesses. Norberto mentioned certainty. To have certainty around what is going to happen next, why are we going to do things in such a fragmented world around data regulation is so important. And then the final point, I just want to congratulate the report on calling out the role of technology itself as a solution. We see references to privacy enhancing technologies, references to data intermediaries. We launched a report in February around trusted digital agency, the idea that an intermediary can be a more sophisticated means of including permissions, whether it be locally in a specific use case or across borders. So in short, we're in a point in time where data has gone from a niche issue to a mainstream issue. It affects everything and everybody. And agile governance has the ability to close some of those silos that we've seen, to increase understanding, increase multi-stakeholder collaboration, and get a little bit smarter, a little bit more sophisticated about what potential solutions we should be harnessing as people right across the world.
Thank you very much, Anne. And this is a message that is resonating on an ongoing basis. I mean, we've heard it in the different comments right now. This notion of agility and agile governance is something that is clearly at the heart of the way to move forward in terms of iteration, something that is more adaptive. We describe the Datasphere as a whole as a complex adaptive system. It is clear that the technological dimension, as you mentioned, is an important element in terms of finding the solution to governance issues. I would be remiss if, when mentioning agile governance, I didn't put a reference to two reports that actually METI has issued in the past regarding precisely governance innovation, and this was something that that was released also in parallel to the release of the We Need to Talk About Data report that was what triggered this whole activity. This was the first round of elements, and I think it's a good opportunity to give the floor again to Lorraine to look in particular at the last elements of the report, which is intending to look and chart a sort of roadmap of how to move forward so that it is something that is tangible and not only a sort of general call for doing regulatory sandboxes, but trying to point in a certain direction regarding how that moves forward. And so I let Lorraine present this in more detail, and then we can have a quick wrap up with the different panelists at the end, with basically in very short comments a few key lessons that have emerged from any practices of regulatory sandboxes in the past at the national level that we need to keep in mind when doing it and trying to do it at the transnational level. But first, Lorraine, glad to have you back. And go ahead on the presentation of the elements of roadmap that is the final part of the report.
Hello, apologies. I hope I won't be interrupted again by unstable connectivity. But it was nice because it broke the presentation a bit in terms of looking at the core aspects that we are looking to around the technologies, but also lessons from different sectors and opportunities in different sectors. Another element that we're looking to also is what are the possible challenges as well that may exist in terms of applying sandboxes, because they clearly come with costs and with need of an involvement and a set of skills as well from the stakeholders that would be involved in this exercise. I invite you to look at the report to see more details on that as well. But the report finishes by setting up a roadmap for what cross-border sandboxes would be like, and take it as a preliminary one as well that will need to, as with good policy experimentation, be iterative as well and applied according to the context. But the steps are 6 in terms of choosing partners and the issues that need to be experimented within the sandboxes, setting a strategy and the goals to ensure partners work well together, identifying and engaging different types of stakeholders, as well as defining the roles of each stakeholder to keep people involved, but also ensuring that they take an active role in the sandbox, And then agreeing on the format, on the duration, because typically sandboxes are time bound, and also on funding. So some questions to think about in this phase: that what are the kind of sandboxes that are the sandbox that is envisaged, what resources need to be allocated for how long it will operate, and then next addressing what are the key issues and the information asymmetries and risks. And finally, and that's a very important step, preparing the criteria for evaluation. It's really important to measure the success or failure of each sandbox, both for public accountability, but also to find out what works and what doesn't, so that the lessons learned can inform future sandboxes and future iterations. And the report concludes with a set of ideas here. The first one is that cross-border regulatory sandboxes can be used to establish and bolster compliant but agile data governance, and that they can be used to solve problems that other linear or traditional methods can struggle with. Sandboxes for data are also still in their infancy. Therefore, we do not know the scope and the scale of issues they can resolve at this stage. So time and resources will be needed to pilot and establish their institutional frameworks, as well as formal and informal working mechanisms for sandboxes. Where the other conclusion is that where innovation is impeded by uncertainty, there is an opportunity to apply sandboxes model to unlock opportunities because of this iterative fashion as well, and agility. And although the report has covered many key issues, many questions remain, and some of them are: can legal restrictions regarding mandates to store data locally be made more flexible by regulatory sandboxes? How do cross-border sandboxes operate in the context of mixed data sets of personal and non-personal data? What should be the fiduciary responsibilities of cross-border data intermediaries or operational sandboxes for that case? So some of those questions that need to be tackled in terms of moving this forward. And moving forward is what I would like to share with you today as well. There are a number of next steps that we're planning for this project. We want to put together an experts group to start after the summer. We're looking for partners for countries, regulators, policymakers, innovators, and stakeholders to contribute to this project as well, and to be part of pilot projects that we want to put together. And we're already talking with a few interested countries who would like to do this sandbox, and also with different stakeholders that would like to think about hybrid approaches as well, that take into account an operational approach to sandbox. And finally, we're putting together a survey. We'll be sharing in the chat, where we invite for your feedback in terms of what challenges you foresee, the usability of sandboxes, but also for you to put your name down in case you want to contribute as an expert or contributor to the next phases of this project. And so just to put it in context, the Sandboxes project is a core part of the Datasphere Initiative Lab. With the lab, what we want is to provide this collective space to experiment with and showcase innovations in governance frameworks and technical solutions that advance the vision of a collaborative governed data sphere. And the objectives of the program are exactly that: to connect actors, to explore innovative concepts, and also to build on the outcomes of the other programs that we're doing, such as the dialogues and the intelligence. So I just want to finish by thanking everyone that contributed to the report, to Maria Farrell, who co-authored the report with me, but also to the expert contributors and revisers, who some of them are here, and to the entire Datasphere Initiative team, who's been wonderful. So I hope that you enjoy the report. And for me, this is just the start. We're kicking off a project that needs to continue ongoing and being experimented and improved upon. And I really look forward to hearing your thoughts on the survey and seeing the names in the list of future contributors to this project as well. And with that, I I give back the floor to Bertrand to this final conclusion. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Lorraine. One quick point that was mentioned in the last presentation slides by Lorraine is the notion of frameworks. And what is becoming extremely important is that the different sandboxes will have specificities, but there are probably patterns that would be interesting to explore in terms of what are the frameworks that distribute the roles and responsibilities of the different actors. Clarify the purpose, clarify the methodology, clarify the objectives, clarify the time bound. And if you think about this, it's sort of trying to explore what could be called mutual affirmation of commitments, where the different participants clearly establish what is the purpose of a specific sandbox. What are the responsibilities? What are the elements of compliance, of monitoring, etc.? So this is one of the things that we will be exploring in the Datasphere Initiative. As you know, the mission is described as developing agile frameworks to responsibly unlock the value of data for all. And that's one of the fields of experimentation. We have a few final minutes. It's always a frustration because we would like to have this discussion going on much further. I would like to go around the table, the virtual table, quickly for a few final comments on basically what are the lessons from what you heard during the different interventions, or what are the lessons that you draw from experiments in regulatory sandboxes that would be useful to keep in mind as we move forward. And this is only given the time that is left, which is basically 6 minutes. If you can, in a few sentences, give your thoughts about this, that would be absolutely great as a conclusion. And maybe I will start first with Morgan Dance to kickstart this final round.
And all panelists for spot on contributions. I was nodding furiously all through the webinar. So in terms of a few sentences, I think we've set out the challenges and the complexity of sandboxes, and thinking about testing across borders is even more challenging and adding in complexity, and that means more resources, more money, more time, and more challenges to tackle. I do think that there are key lessons from the report around the need, which you just mentioned, Bertrand, around the need of clarifying as much as possible, and the goal and the stakeholders that needs to be involved in this project. And I would echo what Norberto said as well around, from a policy making perspective, as a policymaker, thinking about it more agile and not be scared of like risking and trialing and iterating as we're evolving in a fast-paced environment with developing technologies, new regulatory frameworks, and therefore we'll need to kind of adapt and ready to trial and to be a bit flexible moving forward.
Thank you so much. Maybe I'll go in the reverse order from the one that I had. So Anne, do you want to go next?
Thank you, Bertrand, putting me on the spot. I think one of the things that we've learned, particularly from that global network of affiliate centers, is that, and I think it goes down to how you want to define sandboxing, but you can do really amazing things if you have incentives aligning, and those, whether it's a sandbox or whether it's, in our case, an affiliate center where you're I think operationalizing local policy in a local context. I think there are two key things that emerge there. One is the ability to create a space to break those silos. So you don't want to break silos for the sake of it, but something as important and as broad brush as data requires the buy-in of different ministries and different stakeholders. So to provide that space for actors to actually get on with things is really, really important. I think the other thing is how we're seeing almost a pseudo-diplomatic emergence from the ability of those affiliate centers to work with each other. They're learning from each other. They're sharing best practice with each other. And there's no system in place that says formally they must, they must share their insights with each other, but they are naturally doing that. And they are naturally, because they are linked into our global network, they are naturally looking beyond just their own borders. Again, it goes down to providing that space, because at the end of the day, This is not just necessarily about personal data, it's about data and why we want to use data, have certainty. And I just want to call out something Norberto said earlier on as well, which is the importance of human centricity. And it can really, by having that concept of human centricity, you can really start to unlock commonalities across borders.
Thank you, Anne. Norberto.
Thank you, but I'll be telegraphic since we have very little time. I had more things to say, but basically I'll just do kind of bullet points of a couple of takeaways. And I wanted to make 3 cases by taking into account the work that we've been doing at Open Loop and also by reading the report. So the first one would be a case for further granularity in the taxonomy. Really appreciate the work that's been done in differentiating regulatory and operational sandboxes. I think it's important to also see experimentation as a viable vehicle for experimenting before legislation is enacted. So I think there's more work that could be done in adding that complexity in terms of different experimental approaches by looking at the policy and lawmaking cycle. And this is also a case for a more holistic approach to experimental governance to complement all the good work that has been done in terms of regulatory sandboxes and how can they help revise existing legislation. But let's also think of experimentation for forthcoming new legislation in cases when that will be needed. The third case that I would make is for how sandboxes should actually be both and simultaneously regulatory and operational. I don't see why we couldn't mingle these 2 approaches and understand in terms of combinations of data flows and processing, how can that be accompanied by ideas of how that should be governed at a normative level. So I think it would be interesting to explore a mix of these approaches. And finally, how cross-border regulatory sandboxes and other experimental approaches could be useful for further interoperability of national laws or even international agreements.
So many wonderful keywords that resonate again with what we're trying to accomplish. So, Maiko.
She had to leave, Bertrand. So.
She had to leave. Sorry. Yeah, it's particularly late for her. So, Molly.
Just 3 quick things. First, wanted to underscore and completely agree with the points made that data is not a homogeneous entity, and any sandbox initiative would not, treating it as a homogeneous entity would be a very bad idea, given that business data has very different policy implications than private data. One thing we haven't talked about is the competition effects of sandboxes. Obviously, the firms that get accepted have a bit of a competitive advantage over those that applied and didn't get accepted, as well as other firms in the market. That also leads some, at least what we saw, was regulatory arbitrage between jurisdictions. And so thinking about the competition effects of sandboxes is probably important. And then the last thing I'll bring up is thinking about using the idea of a national data strategy as a mechanism to get coherence within one government on how they want to approach regulating data going forward, I think is probably a good step. And what Maiko said was a step-by-step process in getting interoperability across borders. So I'll stop with that, but thank you for the opportunity and congratulations again on the report.
Thank you so much, everyone. A lot of wonderful keywords, even in the last one, like the notion of coherence, interoperability, regulatory arbitrage, etc. I have one sentence to highlight what I've heard during this presentation and this call, is basically that we're in an environment that changes very quickly, where the technology and the legislations or the regulatory environments are constantly interlinked, and there's a wait and see, not for too long, regulation not too fast, and that the general idea of agility and experimentation, the spirit of innovation and communication to bridge silos, is absolutely fundamental to move forward and be able to build, as we aim to accomplish, a collaboratively governed datasphere. So if you found this interesting, if you want to continue to engage, please connect with us. because this is only the start and the foundational stone for the discussion on moving forward towards agile frameworks.